Hey friends, tonight's story begins with the forgotten strength of medieval peasants, everyday survivors of a world that offered little mercy. These were people who didn't just live through history's harshest winters. They endured them with quiet brilliance and stubborn will. From clever tricks with scraps of fabric to sharing body heat like human furnaces, their nightly battle against the cold was nothing short of heroic. Before we journey back in time, give this video a like and subscribe if this kind of slow-burning, immersive storytelling speaks to you. And drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and how cold is it there right now? I love seeing our little story circle stretch across the globe. Now dim the lights. Let the hum of your fan or the crackle of a fireplace soundtrack this tale. We're slipping into the shadows of the past, not of kings or castles, but of villagers, barefoot in the snow, clutching each other for warmth. When you picture the Middle Ages, it's easy to imagine sword fights, royal banquets, and village fairs. But for most people, especially peasants, winter wasn't a season to celebrate, it was a gauntlet. A yearly trial sent by nature herself, cold-blooded and relentless. Surviving wasn't assumed. It was earned. Imagine this. You live in a single-room hut patched together with mud, twigs, and stubborn hope. The walls are so thin you can hear the wind whisper your name from outside, and sometimes you whisper back just to feel less alone. There's no chimney. No real window. Just a hole in the wall plugged with animal hide, and if you're lucky, a wooden door that doesn't creak open every time the wind changes. Your house is barely warmer than the outside world. If it's snowing, you're shivering. If it's freezing, you're numb. Congratulations, you've advanced to stage 2 of not dying. Nights were the cruelest. Darkness swallowed the village whole. The wind shrieked through every crevice, sounding like lost souls searching for shelter. Inside, the fire flickered low, brave, but not quite heroic, offering its meager heat to whoever sat closest. If you were across the room, you might as well be on a hilltop in January. And then there's the fashion, or lack of it. No fur-lined parkas or down comforters. Just layers of scratchy wool tunics and maybe a cloak that doubled as a blanket, a rug, and on bad days, a curtain. You'd wrap yourself like a lumpy burrito and pray the fleas didn't bite too hard. As for the beds, picture a sack of straw that pokes you back every time you move. Maybe there's a few dried rushes tossed in. Maybe a family of mice already claimed the corner. If your nose didn't freeze, your toes probably did. And yet, the most chilling part wasn't the discomfort, it was the danger. Hypothermia wasn't a medical term. It was a silent thief. Frostbite crept in while you slept. Every child's breath that steamed in the cold night air was a gamble. And every elder who fell asleep next to the fire might not wake up. Still, people endured. Somehow. They curled together like kittens, slept in shifts, and kept animals indoors not just for safety but warmth. A cow in the corner might save your life. Survival meant layering every bit of fabric you owned, huddling close, and whispering old stories into the dark to keep your spirits from freezing too. And just when you thought things couldn't get worse, the house itself was your enemy. Medieval homes weren't insulated. They were basically wind chimes disguised as huts. Built from what historians generously call wattle and daub. They were a mix of crisscrossed branches coated in mud, straw, and yes, animal dung. Why dung? Because it stuck. It sealed. And there was always plenty of it. Privacy? None. Comfort? Rare. Survival? Every day, a new battle. So next time you complain about your drafty apartment, just remember, at least your walls aren't made of poop and straw. Probably. Character building? Definitely. Especially when your ceiling occasionally tries to attack you. Let's talk about the roofs. Those picturesque, storybook thatched rooftops. Sure, they look charming from the outside, like something out of a fantasy tale. But after a few good soakings from rain and snow, they sagged like a wet loaf of bread, leaked like a lazy sieve, and became a welcoming mat for every passing squirrel, bird, and mystery critter looking for shelter. Imagine a peaceful dinner ruined by an airborne rodent doing a surprise drop-in. That's not just rustic living, that's medieval chaos. As for windows, if you could even call them that, most were tiny slits, more hole than due, stuffed with animal hide or blocked off with crude wooden shutters. Glass? Forget it. Even the lord in the manor probably had only 1 or 2 tiny panes, like prized gemstones. For a peasant, just keeping the wind from peeling the cowhide off your wall in the middle of a storm was considered luxury living. And let's not ignore the floors. You know, the ones that weren't actually floors but just dirt. Compacted, stomped on earth. During heavy rains or snowmelt, water would seep up from below, turning your living room into a lovely indoor swamp feature. It was technically a natural floor heating and hydration system, if hypothermia was what you were heating up for. In winter, walking around your own house felt like navigating a frozen marsh. The chill didn't just nip at your toes, it came at you from above, below, and within. Cold in stereo. Cold in surround sound. A full-body medieval assault on warmth. And yet, no one was whining. Not really. Because whining wastes breath, and breath meant steam, and steam meant precious body heat escaping. So, people got creative. They stuffed moss into cracks, jammed rags into drafty corners, and formed tight sleeping bundles with family, neighbors, and sometimes even livestock. Human insulation at its most determined. A little ingenuity, a lot of grit, and if you were lucky, a smear of sheep grease on the wall for bonus warmth. Because when your roof leaks, your walls breathe, and your floor tries to freeze you from the feet up, sometimes laughter was the last line of defense. Well, laughter. Or loud. And just when you thought the cold had done enough, it struck from below again. The frozen ground wasn't just uncomfortable. It was your real enemy. Your floor wasn't raised. It was just a spot of dirt someone declared livable. Maybe, if you were lucky, someone had scattered straw or dried rushes over it, like nature's flimsy rug. But let's be honest, you were one thin layer of plant matter away from hugging the earth itself. And that earth? It had no mercy. The cold seeped up like some cruel spirit, slithering through straw, licking your bones, and curling its fingers around your spine. Drop a spoon on the floor during winter? Say goodbye. It now belonged to the frost gods. It was part of the home now. Some folks tried to fight back with layers of straw mats, if you had the money. Or, more likely, if you were brave enough to sneak some from your neighbor's barn without sparking a feud that would last generations. Even then, straw wasn't exactly the gift that kept on giving. It flattened quickly, molded faster, and added a delightful crunch to every freezing midnight step. Others used rushes. Dried plants laid down in layers. Sounds cozy, right? But nobody cleaned out the old ones. Ever. They just added more on top like nature's lazy version of carpet padding. Over time, you weren't walking on a floor so much as compost in progress. A warm, living, breathing bed of rotting vegetation, mystery bugs, and a smell that said, "I give up." It was medieval floor fashion at its finest, part mulch, part mattress, all misery. But somehow, through rot and rodents, leaks and lungfuls of icy air, they kept going. They kept surviving. Because that's what medieval peasants did best. Beds, if you were lucky enough to have one, weren't exactly the stuff of dreams. More often than not, they were just crude wooden frames filled with, you guessed it, another layer of straw or hay. No springs. No softness. Just a scratchy, uneven surface that crunched when you shifted and poked you when you didn't. Instead of comfort, the bed was your battleground, a nightly wrestling match against the cold rising from the floor beneath. Tossing and turning wasn't for finding the sweet spot. It was a frantic, half-conscious dance to keep your limbs from going numb. You didn't sleep to rest. You slept to survive. And a good night's rest didn't mean dreaming. It meant waking up with all your fingers and toes still attached. If you pulled that off, you were already ahead of the game. When it came to medieval homes in winter, there was one unsung hero that stood out, not the walls packed with dung and moss, not the roof that occasionally caved in under snow. It was the hearth. A stubborn, smoldering fire pit in the center of the home that did its best to hold back the endless dark and cold. It wasn't glamorous, but it was sacred. The hearth was warmth, light, food, protection, and most importantly, life. Forget stone mantles or elegant chimneys. These fires lived in shallow pits, ringed with cracked stones and scorched memories. No chimney swept the smoke away. It just found its own way out. Maybe it floated lazily through a hole in the roof, maybe it squeezed through the walls, or maybe, and most often, it hung in the room like a ghost, drifting into your lungs with every breath you took. Sure, it wasn't great for your health. But it was excellent at killing fleas. The hearth wasn't just a heat source. It was the kitchen, the nightlight, the storyteller, the babysitter, and the best entertainment this side of the feudal system. Families gathered around it after sundown, swapping gossip, sharing tales, or just staring into the fire, hypnotized by its glow because, frankly, there wasn't much else to do. It was the medieval version of Netflix. Low budget, but always on. And keeping that fire alive? That wasn't optional. Letting it die overnight was like leaving your door open for the cold to waltz in and take what little life you had left. Starting a fire again wasn't easy. No matches. No lighters. Just flint, steel, and desperate prayer. If that spark didn't catch, you were in for a miserable morning, assuming you made it to morning at all. Everyone in the house had a job: feed the fire, watch the embers, protect the flame like your life depended on it, because it did. Fuel wasn't exactly lying around in neat little bundles. Sometimes you had a bit of peat, some twigs, or if fortune smiled on you, a dry log from last autumn. Most days you burned whatever you could find and hoped it wouldn't smoke you out. It was a never-ending battle, human will versus creeping frost. A tiny flame standing alone against a sea of night. The hearth might sputter. It might smoke. It might barely warm the toes of the person sitting closest. But still, it burned. And in a world of bitter winds and brittle bones, that meant everything. If there was one thing peasants feared more than famine or taxes, it was the moment the fire went out overnight. No glow. No crackle. Just silence, and the slow, quiet return of winter's grip. Reigniting it in the cold dark was no small feat. It required frozen fingers, a steady hand, and kindling you hadn't already used 3 nights ago. So imagine it, pitch black, your breath clouding in front of you, every spark a prayer. Flint strikes steel, steel kisses tinder. One ember flares, you cradle it like it's your only child, feed it with scraps of bark and hope. If it catches, you're saved. If it doesn't, well, you better start chipping ice off your blanket, because in the medieval night, the hearth wasn't just a fire. The flicker of survival in a world that didn't care if you made it to morning. Now, imagine this, the wind outside shrieking like a banshee, and somewhere in the distance, the long, bone-chilling howl of a hungry wolf echoes through the darkness. Just in case you needed extra motivation to keep that fire alive. Peasants weren't fools. They learned tricks, and one of the most important was fire banking. No, not some cozy medieval savings plan. This kind of banking meant carefully tucking glowing embers beneath a blanket of ash before going to sleep. The ash served as insulation, protecting the heat, muffling the oxygen, and cradling those little flickers of life through the long, frozen night. If you did it right, you could shuffle over in the morning, poke the pile with a stick, toss on a log, and just like that, fire. Warmth without the agony of flint, steel, and frozen fingers. If you did it wrong? Well, mornings got colder. Tempers got shorter. And suddenly, no one was speaking to Dad for letting the hearth die at 2 a.m. Fire banking wasn't just a skill. It was a tradition, passed from generation to generation like a family recipe or a very smoky bedtime ritual. Everyone had their opinion. Dry ash only, some said. No, a little dampness locks in heat, others swore. Pack the coals tight. No, give them room to breathe. It was like medieval barbecue arguments, only instead of ribs, the stakes were your survival. Of course, even the best technique couldn't stop everything. Sometimes, a rogue wind would find its way in and snuff out the coals. Other times, a confused sheep might clomp through the house and stomp right into the hearth. Yes, this happened. Which is why many families had a rotation, someone always on ember duty, getting up in the middle of the night to check the warmth. The medieval version of half-asleep trips to the thermostat. Fire banking wasn't about mastering nature. It was about bargaining with it. Just a few more hours. Just enough heat to see the dawn. And if you woke to find a single ember still glowing in the ash, that was your victory. That was your warmth for the day ahead. And then there was the other method of staying warm. Quantity. The phrase, "the more the merrier," wasn't just a proverb. In the middle of a freezing medieval winter, it was a survival tactic. When the fire barely flickered and the icy wind rattled through every gap in the walls, there was one thing you could count on: each other. If that meant piling in with your parents, siblings, your neighbor's cousin, and a goat who refused to sleep outside, so be it. Comfort was optional. Staying alive was not. Personal space? Not a thing. Privacy? Never heard of her. On the coldest nights, survival meant becoming a pile of snoring, twitching, breathing human insulation. Entire households would cram into the warmest corner of the hut, wrapped in every wool scrap, ragged cloak, and moth-eaten curtain they owned, forming a sleepy sandwich of desperation and love. Children squirmed into the center, where warmth was highest. Elders were tucked carefully into the folds, as far from the drafty wall as possible. And if Cousin Ethel showed up unexpectedly, you made room. Because Ethel might be loud, but she was warm. Landing the middle spot was like winning the peasant lottery. You got body heat from all sides, a human furnace. Land on the outer edge? You were the sacrificial layer, pressed against the chill like a frozen loaf of bread. And heaven helped the restless sleeper. One wrong toss or midnight stretch, and suddenly you'd shoved your Aunt Maud straight into the cold void by the wall. There she goes, muttering curses, half asleep and half frozen. But still, they huddled. They pressed together, sharing warmth, breath, and hope. Because in a world where fire could fade and frost came through the floor, sometimes all you had was each other. You've now become the family villain, all because you rolled over in your sleep and elbowed Granny into the draft. And sometimes, it wasn't even your own blanket you were fighting for. Bedding was often shared, one flattened, scratchy, communal straw mattress used by generation after generation. And because personal hygiene wasn't exactly peaking in the 1300s, let's just say it was less lavender dreams and more barnyard bouquet. But in a war between you and frostbite, you stopped being picky real fast. Body heat wasn't just a bonus. It was a full-blown survival strategy. Some practical medieval guides even offered advice. Place the warmest and sturdiest bodies along the outer edge, forming a living barrier against the cold. Babies, the elderly, and anyone particularly delicate got tucked into the center, like treasured hot water bottles with feet. This wasn't just smart, it was sacred. Warmth was love. Warmth was life. Over time, this nighttime strategy turned into a tradition. Long, dark winters curled around shared wool blankets gave rise to stories, lullabies, murmured gossip, and the occasional snort laugh from someone dreaming about cheese. Family bonding came not from quiet dinners, but from elbow-to-elbow sleeping arrangements beneath the same itchy wool sheet. So the next time your sibling steals the covers, or your dog claims half the bed, just be grateful you're not wedged between a snoring uncle and a goat with opinions. And if you thought your roommates were difficult, try surviving winter in a one-room hut with your entire household and your livestock. Cows, goats, pigs, chickens, anything with a heartbeat and a hint of body heat got invited in. Bringing animals inside wasn't just a rustic quirk. It was life or death engineering. In homes with no insulation and wind so sharp it could cut your breath in half, every warm body helped. Plus, keeping your goat close meant it was harder for your neighbor to accidentally borrow it in the middle of the night. Warmth and theft prevention? A medieval win-win. Come nighttime, the humble peasant home transformed into a chaotic, clucking, snorting furnace of survival. Chickens fluffed up in corners. Pigs snored dramatically near the hearth. And cows, the queens of warmth, lounged near the center like they owned the place, chewing cud with an attitude that said, "You're welcome." It wasn't elegant. Far from it. If you've ever ridden in a car during summer with someone who forgot deodorant, now replace that person with a cow. And lock the windows. And now make it winter. And you're sleeping next to it. By spring, the signature scent of a medieval winter household could knock you sideways. Candles? Who needs candles when the walls themselves tell stories through smell? But over time, peasants developed a kind of selective smelling, the same way you learn to ignore your little brother's feet after the third day of a road trip. Because they understood the truth: the more animals indoors, the fewer frostbitten fingers and toes outside. Certain animals got the VIP treatment. Cows, warm and large, earned their place near the center. Goats, pushy little survivalists, always found a way closer to the heat, whether they were invited or not. Chickens settled in rafters, old crates, or anything vaguely nest-shaped. And pigs? Pigs didn't care. They parked themselves wherever they felt like, often in the very middle of the room, unapologetically cozy. Of course, sharing your bedroom with barn animals had its complications. Imagine drifting peacefully to sleep, only to be woken by a chicken pecking your forehead because it mistook your hair for straw. Or stepping on something mysterious and squishy on your way to the door in the morning. Yes, medieval mornings were full of surprises, none of them scented with vanilla. Still, despite the clatter, the stink, the misplaced hooves, and the occasional rude awakening from a goat's sneeze, peasants knew the math. Cold kills. And cows? They cuddle. Whether they want to or not. In the eternal battle between human warmth and winter's icy grip, the damp, grassy breath of a nearby cow could mean the difference between seeing spring or becoming part of the landscape. Medieval fashion wasn't about turning heads. It was about keeping them attached. Peasants weren't chasing trends. They were gearing up for daily war against the cold. The rule was brutally simple: if you owned it, wear it. And then maybe borrow something else and wear that too. The base layer? A linen undershirt, scratchy, stained, and probably harboring more stories than the village elder. Over that, a thicker wool tunic. Maybe two, if luck or inheritance smiled on you. Add saggy woolen leggings that never quite stayed up, a rough cloak slung across your shoulders, and for the truly blessed, a ragged sheepskin tossed on top like a badge of medieval honor. Congratulations, you're now 10% warmer and 90% itchier. As for footwear? Boots were the stuff of legends and landlords. Most peasants made do with wrapped rags or old cloth, layered until their feet resembled sad, bandaged root vegetables. Stuff those into wooden clogs, and if the frost still got through, toss in another rag and hope you still had 10 toes by sunrise. Laundry? No thanks. Washing your clothes in winter meant breaking ice in a stream, scrubbing with frozen hands, and then waiting 2 days for your only tunic to dry, assuming it didn't turn into a stiff linen popsicle in the meantime. Most folks chose the simpler path: embrace the stench, keep the warmth. And here's the wild part: all that dirt, grease, and sweat? It actually helped. Layers of grime formed a kind of crusty insulation, sealing in heat. Think of it as medieval Gore-Tex, but more barnyard than backcountry. It wasn't pleasant, but it worked. Hats, scarves, gloves, these were treasures. A woolen cap could mean the difference between sleeping soundly or waking up with your hair frozen to the wall. Gloves? Often stitched together from scraps of leather or spare cloth, and usually looked like a failed puppet project. Still, better than nothing. Children didn't escape the chill either. They were bundled so thoroughly they resembled walking turnips, waddling awkwardly around the house, arms stiff, eyes peeking out from layers of wool. Fashionable? No. Toasty? Hopefully. The goal wasn't elegance. It was survival. Warmth was the only style that mattered, and if you looked like a pile of laundry with legs, so be it. So next time you grumble about throwing on a jacket, remember, medieval peasants went full layered mode, walking around like woolen onions and proud of it. In their world, dirt wasn't something you washed off, it was armor. In fact, grime had a reputation. It wasn't a sign of laziness. It was tactical. It was genius. Because winter had one job: to steal your heat. And freshly washed clothes? They made it too easy. Linen might have breathed well in summer, but in January, breathable meant, "Please take all my warmth." That's where dirt came in. After weeks or months without a rinse, layers of natural oils, dried sweat, mud, soot, and other delightful additions would form a kind of personal weatherproofing on your clothes. It was gross. It was sticky. But it was oddly effective. Peasants trudged through life crusted in a living blanket of their environment, wearing the landscape, becoming part of it. Tunics stiff with soil. Cloaks padded with grease. And as awful as that sounds, it kept the cold out. Because sometimes survival doesn't smell like roses. Sometimes it smells like smoke, sheep, and victory. Over time, this natural crust, a charming mix of sweat, smoke, and soil, began to seal tiny gaps in the fabric, transforming ragged tunics into accidental armor. It was medieval weatherproofing at its most pungent. Sure, you smelled like a goat who'd lost a bar brawl, but guess what? You were warm and alive. Some folks even believed that bathing during winter could make you sick. Best not to mess with the protective, holy filth, barrier nature had so generously provided. Cleanliness may have been next to godliness, but in February, it was a bit too close to the grave. Bathing was rare. Doing laundry? Rarer still. And if soap showed up, you could be sure it was either a holy day, the bishop was in town, or someone was about to meet their maker. Clothes were layered without much thought for rotation. You didn't change the shirt underneath, you just kept adding more on top until you were basically a woolen onion of questionable scent. Eventually, you became a living archive. Every stain a souvenir, every patch a badge of survival. That dark mark on your sleeve? From slipping in the mud outside the pigsty. The odd smell on your collar? Might be stew. Might not. Either way, you're still here. To the outside world, medieval peasants might have looked, and smelled, like hygiene had packed up and left town, but they knew better. That crusty, crunchy tunic? It was thermal defense. A dirty kind of dignity. It didn't sparkle, but neither did frostbite. And truth be told, when everyone smelled like cooked onions and sheep, nobody was really offended. In fact, you could say stench was the great medieval equalizer. Nose blindness wasn't a flaw, it was a survival skill. So yes, in the great seasonal war of survival, filth wasn't failure. It was function. It was fashion. And if, by mid-February, you had a thick, greasy outer layer, well then, congratulations, you were doing it right. Now, if you're picturing medieval peasants curling up each night under feather-stuffed duvets and embroidered quilts, stop. Reset that image. Replace it with something a bit more grounded. Literally. Beds, for those lucky enough to have them, were usually wooden frames with a sack thrown on top, stuffed with straw, hay, or old rushes. That's it. No memory foam. No springs. Just a lumpy, creaky, barn-scented heap that crinkled every time you rolled over and occasionally poked you in places best left unmentioned. And if you didn't have a frame? No problem. Just toss the straw straight on the packed dirt floor and call it a night. What today's influencers might label earth-connected sleep was really just. We ran out of lumber. These beds weren't built to last. The straw flattened quickly, soaked up moisture, grew mold, attracted bugs, and over time, became an ecosystem all its own. Changing the bedding was a major event, usually done a few times a year, or when the mattress started crawling. Rushes were a common substitute. Long green grasses, spread across the floor and sometimes mixed with sweet-smelling herbs like lavender or rosemary to disguise the less-than-sweet scent of everyday life. They smelled wonderful, for about 24 hours. After that, they blended seamlessly with the mud, dropped food, livestock droppings, and whatever else wandered in through the door. And then there were the roommates. Not just the two-legged kind. Fleas, lice, and other delightful freeloaders considered straw bedding their personal paradise. If you spent more time scratching than sleeping, congratulations, you were living the full medieval dream. But despite the discomfort, despite the filth and the fleas, these humble beds were essential. They weren't glamorous. They didn't inspire poetry. But they kept you off the frozen ground. And sometimes, that was all the comfort you needed. A humble pile of straw wasn't just bedding, it was insulation. A barrier between your bones and the frozen dirt beneath. Add a few family members huddled tightly together, and suddenly you had pockets of shared warmth. Call it primitive. Call it desperate. But really, it was medieval central heating at its absolute finest. So, the next time you collapse into a memory foam mattress and scroll through sleep playlists, just picture a peasant somewhere in the afterlife, grinning through a mouthful of missing teeth and muttering, "Must be nice." When your home is built from sticks, mud, and sheer optimism, winter breezes don't feel poetic. They feel personal. They aren't just drafts. They're ambushes. Peasants had to battle the cold not only outside, but from within the very walls meant to shelter them. And those walls? Let's just say they had commitment issues. The thatch sagged. The mud cracked. The wood warped. Each night, the cold found new paths inside, like a ghost that knew your floor plan better than you did. Holding it back required every scrap of resourcefulness you had. Sealing the house became a seasonal art form. Cracks were stuffed with moss, straw, animal hair, old cloth, dried grass. If it was soft, flexible, and not currently on fire, it was fair game. Some households even slapped on extra layers of mud and dung to the outside walls, an annual tradition as glamorous as it sounds. Picture this, standing in the snow, slathering frozen manure onto your own house and muttering, "Ah yes, peak luxury." Because honestly, it kind of was. The roof? That was another battlefield entirely. Thatch might have been cheap, but waterproof it was not. After a few rough seasons, your ceiling leaked more than your cousin's storytelling. Holes were patched with scraps of cloth, bundles of reeds, or, in a moment of true desperation, bits of turf swiped from the field next door. Eventually, the whole house began to resemble a sad patchwork quilt, one stitched together by hope, panic, and a total lack of professional training. Doors and windows? Optional. If you had them, They were usually just wood planks held in place by iron nails and sheer stubbornness. Window holes got the deluxe treatment, thick cloth or animal hides, sometimes soaked in fat to block wind and add a rich aroma of roasted mystery meat to the room. Each night was a chess match with the cold. One moment you were toasty. The next, a gust of wind would find the one crack you missed and slap you awake like winter itself was keeping score. And yet peasants endured. With clever hands, gritty resolve, and an unspoken agreement that, mostly frozen, was still better than entirely dead, they plugged, patted, and patched their way through the season, one muddy, determined handful at a time. But sometimes, even stuffing every gap and feeding the fire wasn't enough. When the chill was too deep to ignore, medieval households turned to a simple yet effective strategy: staggered sleeping shifts. Forget strict schedules or military precision. There were no whistles, no rotations. Just instinct, urgency, and exhaustion. Half the family stayed awake, eyes blinking through smoke, tending the embers and plugging new drafts as they appeared. The other half tried to catch whatever sleep they could, curled beneath warm blankets and hay, dozing in fits and shivers. It wasn't restful, but it was necessary. The fire, that fragile flicker of life in the center of the room, demanded constant care. Let it die, and you might not make it to morning. So while one brother dozed, the other fed the flames. While one child dreamed, a parent checked the walls. Survival wasn't about comfort. It was about endurance, shared responsibility, and a never-ending rotation of half-sleep, half-watch. Because in the medieval world, warmth was never guaranteed. You earned it, hour by hour, ember by ember. Left to its own devices, the fire would simply fade away, and relighting it was about as fun as teaching a donkey to waltz. That meant someone had to be on ember duty. And since nobody wanted to abandon their hard-won sliver of warmth, families did what they always did: they shared the burden. Shifts were rotated. You nap for a bit, then get nudged awake, grumble your way across the room, and try to coax a flicker from a sulky bed of ash, all while avoiding stepping on a disgruntled goat in the dark. There was nothing glamorous about it. No glowing buttons, no smart apps, and definitely no "just 5 more minutes" snooze options. Only groggy limbs, aching knees, and rising frustration at whoever was snoring peacefully during your turn. Children who were old enough to hold a stick were handed one and pointed at the hearth. Because in winter, everyone had a job. Either pull your weight or freeze trying. Even the elders pitched in when they could. Grandparents often lingered by the fire longer, partly out of wisdom, and partly because once you're down, getting back up again with medieval joints was an expedition. And when it was finally your time to sleep, good luck. Between people shifting around, goats huffing, wind battering the walls, and a sibling elbowing you in the ribs mid-dream, getting real rest was a miracle. Yet somehow it worked. One half of the family slept. The other half stayed alert, watching, waiting, feeding the flame like it was their last hope. And in many ways it was. So the fire lived. And because the fire lived, so did they. So next time you groan about getting out of bed to adjust the thermostat or let the cat out, spare a warm thought for the medieval peasant who stood at 3 a.m., squinting at a dying fire and wondering, how important are toes, really? Because you know it's cold when you have to think about how you breathe just to stay alive. Medieval peasants didn't just wrap themselves in cloaks and hope for the best. They adapted, right down to their breathing. The problem? Big gulps of icy air straight into your lungs were a fast ticket to illness. And when pneumonia lurked behind every frosty gust, staying warm wasn't just about blankets, it was about breath control. So, they learned what we might now call survival breathing. Slow. Shallow. Through the nose, not the mouth. Let the air warm just a little before it hit your lungs. Was it perfect? No. But it beat hacking up pieces of your soul come February. If you didn't mess up and took in one of those deep, frosty gasps, congratulations, you'd earned yourself a week of coughing fits, zero sleep, and healing rituals that included hot onion tea and your grandmother's firmest, most judgmental prayers. Some folks even pulled their cloaks, shawls, or spare bits of cloth over their faces while sleeping, a makeshift heat trap to warm the air before it entered their lungs. Of course, you'd wake up with a damp rag stuck to your face, but it was better than freezing from the inside out. Kids were taught these tricks early. Parents would hiss warnings at little ones for breathing too hard or fast, especially inside. No panting. No gasping. Breathe like a monk, not like a puppy. Between that, itchy wool underlayers, constant cold drafts, and the occasional goat with poor digestive timing, childhood winters were less magical wonderland, and more trial by frost. But they made it through. One breath at a time. One ember at a time. And if you ever think your winter's a bit rough, just remember, you've never had to fall asleep slow breathing through a snot-damp scarf with a goat warming your feet and frost creeping through the walls. That's not just surviving. That's medieval resilience. At night, bundled in layers of itchy wool, buried in straw, and nestled beside a softly steaming cow, breathing wasn't just instinct, it was strategy. Inhale through the nose, exhale slowly. Minimal movement. Maximum control. Like a medieval yoga retreat, except colder, darker, and featuring more frostbite than mindfulness quotes. In the Grand Survival Handbook, this wasn't a flashy technique. But it worked. One shallow breath at a time, peasants battled through another pitch-black night in their long, quiet war against winter's icy siege. But they didn't just rely on breath and blankets. In the relentless cold of a medieval winter, peasants had another unexpected secret weapon, a full belly. Turns out, one of the best ways to stay warm wasn't another woolen cloak. It was calories. The more food your body had to process, the more heat it generated in the effort. Basic medieval thermodynamics: eat big, stay warm, maybe survive. So, what did dinner look like for someone trying not to freeze to death in the dark? Imagine a pot of thick, earthy stew bubbling away with turnips, onions, and whatever root vegetables survived the cellar. Grains were also a staple: oat porridge, chewy barley, or slices of heavy, dense rye bread that doubled as insulation from within. And if the stars aligned, maybe after a slaughter, festival, or miracle, a slab of salted pork or a scrap of dried sausage might find its way into the pot. This wasn't gourmet dining. No plating techniques. No garnish. Just one big, brown, steaming heap designed to settle in your gut like a warm brick and radiate heat into the night. But there was science to the madness. It wasn't just about eating a lot, it was about eating smart. Foods that took longer to digest kept your body's internal furnace burning for hours. Fats were especially prized. They burned slow and kept your core toasty well into the frosty dawn. A pot of stew. a hunk of bread, a questionable scoop of lard. Peak peasant luxury. Even picky children weren't spared. Little Thomas didn't like turnips? Too bad. You ate the turnips, or you spent the night shivering and regretting your life choices. Call it harsh love, medieval style. Of course, heavy bedtime meals came with their own price. Sure, you'd stay warmer, but your dreams might include talking pigs, dancing cabbages, and the terrifying sensation of being chased by a loaf of rye. Still, better to be warm and haunted than cold and conscious. Because at the end of the day, peasants weren't out to impress anyone. They were out to survive. And if that meant going to bed full, bloated, and gently nose-breathing beside a farting cow, then so be it. And for those who wanted just a bit more warmth, who didn't? Medieval ingenuity kicked in again. Long before electric blankets or high-tech heating pads, peasants turned to two humble heroes, the hay box and the heated stone. Let's start with the hay box. It may sound rustic, and that's because it was. But it was also pure brilliance. You took a solid wooden box, lined it with hay, and used it like a primitive thermal chamber. Cook your stew, your porridge, or your lentils during the day, then tuck the pot inside the hay box, cover it up, and boom, it stayed warm for hours. Dinner stayed edible. Midnight snacks became possible. All without reigniting a dying fire or letting more cold creep into the house. And on a freezing night, something warm to eat, even hours later, could feel like a miracle. They were, in essence, medieval slow cookers, the hay boxes. But the cleverness didn't stop at stew. Peasants soon realized, if hay could trap heat from a pot of porridge, it could trap the warmth of something even better. Rocks. Thus began the reign of the heated stone. Before bedtime, someone, usually whichever unlucky child lost the argument, was sent to fetch a flat stone and toss it directly into the glowing heart of the hearth. After it baked until nearly glowing, resting somewhere between cozy and third-degree hazard, it was carefully retrieved with tongs, sticks, or any implement that wouldn't result in immediate regrets. Still sizzling, the stone would be swaddled in rags, tucked inside old cloth, or placed into a clay pot like a precious ember treasure. Then it was slipped under the straw in the mattress or nestled at the foot of the bed. Voila! A medieval heating pad, ready to battle the cold creeping through the floor. Of course, not everything always went to plan. Wrap it wrong, and congratulations, you've just invented a localized house fire. Drop it on your foot. Welcome to winter injury season, now featuring burns and bruises. But when it worked beautifully. That radiant stone could stay warm for hours, giving you just enough comfort to fall asleep without praying for spring every 5 minutes. It wasn't luxurious, but when your house was part mud, part miracle, and mostly freezing, luxury simply meant not waking up with icicles on your nose. In the toolkit of medieval winter survival, a single hot stone buried in hay didn't look like much. But for a peasant fighting for every degree of warmth, it was a quiet, glowing miracle. And central to all this, the true heart of the home, was the hearth. It wasn't just where you cooked meals. It was the very soul of the house. Smoky, stubborn, crackling with life, the hearth was a moody companion, but without it, you had no chance. Come nighttime, proximity to that fire could mean the difference between rising with the sun or never rising at all. So sleeping arrangements weren't dictated by comfort or seniority. They were dictated by survival. The frail, the elderly, the infants, they got the warm zone. That coveted real estate right near the hearth. Parents, sturdier children, and adults fanned out from there like layers of living insulation. It wasn't just kindness. It was practical, thermal math. Babies were tiny, delicate furnaces that needed protection. Elders were walking libraries, filled with stories, knowledge, and gossip too precious to lose to a cold snap. But even fire came with danger. Too far and you froze. Too close, and you risked waking up with a toasty toe or your cloak smoldering like it had dreams of becoming a campfire. Yes, warmth was essential, but timing, distance, and a little bit of luck kept it from turning into a singed surprise. Because when you're sleeping inches from open flame in a thatched hut full of flammable people, too cozy can be a problem. Still, night after night, the hearth held on. And so did they. Stray too far from the hearth, and you might as well be camping in a glorified icebox. Staying warm was a delicate, nightly dance. Get close enough to soak up the fire's glow, but not so close that you ended up looking like a half-baked roast. The fire didn't share its warmth generously. It played favorites. It mainly toasted the lucky few seated directly in front of it, while the rest of the household jostled for space in the narrow cone of heat like cold lizards chasing a sunbeam. If you managed to fall asleep facing the fire, you might enjoy the rare luxury of having one side blissfully toasty, and the other frozen stiff enough to knock on. Pets didn't miss the memo either. Dogs wriggled into prime firefront positions, tails wagging dangerously close to the flames, while chickens perched like tiny feathered sentries on warm stones, quietly clucking as if guarding the sacred heat. Each pop of the logs, each sleepy crackle of embers, whispered the same fragile promise: you're still alive. You're still warm, for now. And so, peasants drifted into a fitful sleep, breathing out soft puffs that hung in the cold air just outside the hearth's glow. It wasn't ideal. It wasn't cozy. But it was survival, warmth held by the thread of glowing coals and pure determination. In medieval winters, no one survived alone, not unless they were aiming to become an elegant frost-covered lawn ornament by January. Staying alive wasn't just a family affair, it was a village-wide operation. A messy, noisy, mud-covered collaboration where your breath, your fire, your fate was tied to everyone around you. Peasants knew, a fire and a pile of hay could only get you so far. If your neighbor's chimney went cold, you noticed. If smoke stopped curling from old Tom's roof, someone would check. Not just because Tom owed you a chicken, though let's be honest, that helped, but because community was the cornerstone of survival. Villages had their own version of winter watchmen. Not soldiers, but the elderly, the young, the injured, folks who couldn't work the fields but could still keep an eye out. Who was coughing too hard? Who hadn't shown up at the market in days? Whose windows stayed dark too long after sunrise? These were the unofficial sentinels of the cold months. No reflective vests, but plenty of wool, weathered eyes, and more sheep than anyone wanted indoors. If a family's fire died, it was nearly an emergency. A good neighbor would come running with a glowing ember wrapped in rags. Better yet, they might open their already cramped home, making space for one more freezing soul. Was it crowded? Absolutely. Was it preferable to discovering frozen neighbors come spring thaw? Without question. Communal food stores mattered too. When winter grew vicious, villages sometimes pooled what little they had left, salted meat, wrinkled grains, dried vegetables. It was bleak generosity. No one had extra, but a few shared meals could tip the scale between surviving or fading before spring. Even the smallest villagers had their part to play. Children delivered firewood, shared embers, and ran quick-footed through the snow with news when help was needed. Nobody was too young. Nobody too tired. When the wind howled through the valley, every hand, even the tiny ones, was needed. Sure, medieval villages weren't strangers to drama. Feuds flared. Goats were borrowed without permission. Someone always remembered who dented whose iron pot. But as the nights stretched long and the cold pressed in, even old grudges got quietly folded away like a too-thin blanket. Because even your worst rival was still worth saving, because tomorrow, it might be you in need of rescue. When winter tightened its grip, the village became one great, stubborn, scrappy family. Not perfect. Rarely quiet. But fiercely committed to dragging each other through the frost. One muddy boot step, one glowing ember, one shared bowl of stew, one half-frozen laugh at a time. When the unforgiving grip of winter closed in, medieval peasants didn't just reach for cloaks or pile more logs on the fire, they reached for faith. Because when the wind screamed like wolves outside walls made of sticks and mud, and the hearth dimmed to a few stubborn embers, you needed more than body heat. You needed a miracle. Prayer was not a formality. It was survival in spoken form. Each frozen breath, each shiver beneath straw and scratchy wool, carried with it whispered pleas. Families would kneel together in the fire's fading light, voices low and urgent. Prayers for strength, for warmth, for their thatched roof to hold another night, and for their toes to still be attached by morning. Saints were not distant icons. They were lifelines. Saint Blaise, for example, was summoned to guard throats from the bite of cold air, a real concern when one gasp of frost could mean days of coughing and nights of fever. Saint Nicholas, centuries before reindeer and sleighs, was known as a protector of homes from ruin, especially in those lean, grim midwinter weeks. Superstition and faith twined together in nightly rituals. Some families sprinkled holy water near the hearth before sleep, hoping it might chase away wicked spirits, or at least ward off a particularly malevolent draught. Others marked their doorframes with blessed chalk after feast days, inviting luck and warmth to find their way inside. Candles, too, flickered with purpose. Special vigil candles, blessed by a priest or the most devout widow in the village, burned through the night, small golden sentinels holding back the dark. And always, always there were promises. Lord, if you just get us through this night, I'll be better. Kinder, I'll stop cursing the neighbor who keeps stealing our turnips. Faith wasn't abstract comfort. It was negotiation. It was hope braided into desperation, not for riches, just for another day. A little warmth. A little food. And maybe, just maybe, a hint of spring somewhere on the horizon. That hope was whispered into the rafters, folded into scratchy bedding, breathed into the cold night air with chapped lips and clenched jaws. It wasn't graceful, but it carried them through. And yet, not always. For all their prayers and grit, the truth was chilling. Sometimes, winter still won. And when it did, it didn't steal just one or two. Sometimes it swallowed whole families, entire villages, silenced beneath drifts of snow and thick slabs of ice. Some winters struck with particular cruelty, like the Great Famine of 1315, when ceaseless rain rotted crops, cattle died by the hundreds, and freezing temperatures turned hunger into horror. Desperate people resorted to unthinkable things. Stories murmured through history, of gnawed bark, boiled leather shoes, and worse still, of those who turned on one another. Failure to keep the hearth alive wasn't a mild discomfort. It was a death sentence. Without that fragile ember, families huddled one last time, not for rest, but for warmth they couldn't create. Spring sometimes arrived bearing heartbreak. Neighbors would push open doors to silent homes, finding bodies curled together in final embraces, as if clinging to the memory of warmth. They froze not apart, but together. Homes could betray them, too. Roofs groaned under the burden of snow, then gave way with thunderous finality. Ice storms shattered thatch and snapped timbers. When your roof collapsed at midnight in midwinter, it was not an inconvenience, it was an ending. And if you did manage to crawl out, through snow to a neighbor's door, you weren't guaranteed help. Because they too might be cold, hungry, and holding on to life by a thread. Even the village had limits. Not every knock was answered. Not every prayer was enough. But they kept knocking. And they kept praying. Because that's what survival required. Disease loved the cold just as much as it loved the weak. Starvation drained strength. Tight, smoky homes became perfect incubators for deadly infections, pneumonia, bronchitis, fevers that lingered like ghosts. A single cough in December could quietly become a funeral by January. And then came frostbite, the quiet horror. Fingers, toes, even ears slowly blackened and died while still attached to their owners. Some villagers survived the season, but left pieces of themselves behind in the snow. They wore those missing parts like grim medals, the kind that said, "I lived." But winter took its price. What's most haunting isn't the death itself. It's how expected it was. Each winter, people quietly acknowledged that some among them would not live to see the thaw. Death didn't sneak in, it was practically invited, a silent visitor wrapped in frost, waiting its turn by the door. And yet, amid the loss, the cold, the fear, medieval peasants pressed on. They mourned. They endured. They kept breathing, kept tending the fire, because as long as there was one ember left in the hearth and one breath hanging in the frozen air, there was still a fight worth fighting. When we picture these frostbitten survivors, muddy, chapped, wrapped in patched cloaks, it's easy to focus on their hardship. The smoke-stung eyes. The numb limbs. The nights filled with hunger and coughing. But buried beneath all that suffering is something far more powerful, a legacy of unrelenting creativity and impossible endurance. They had no central heating. No waterproof boots. No warm beds or cozy fleece jackets. They didn't even have the confidence that they'd make it to spring. But what they did have was resilience, raw, stubborn, and deeply human. Every straw-filled mattress, every ember-stuffed hearth, every crack sealed with moss or mud was an act of innovation under pressure. When faced with impossible odds, they didn't fold. They adapted. They learned from each bitter season, from the land, from another, and from the cruel lessons etched into each passing winter. Their strength wasn't just individual. It was collective. They built communities not just from soil and stone, but from shared survival. They watched over the sick. They rationed food. They understood that warming a neighbor today might mean someone would save you tomorrow. Their faith wasn't performative. It was fuel. They wove prayers into the fabric of their daily lives, not only from fear, but from fragile, persistent hope. Hope that tomorrow might be a little warmer, a little brighter. Hope that the ice would melt, that the sun would rise again, that life would return to the frozen ground. And somehow, miraculously, it did. Because of their grit and sacrifice. Because of their hard-won, unspectacular victories, surviving one more night, one more storm, generations after them were able to thrive. Bit by frozen bit, they dragged humanity forward, until warmth and safety became common expectations instead of distant, desperate dreams. Their fingerprints, rough, callous, frostbitten, are stitched invisibly into the lives we live today. Every soft blanket, every warm room, every peaceful winter evening spent sipping tea beneath soft light. Those are their victories, paid for with hardship we'll never fully understand. So the next time the wind howls beyond your double-paned window, take a moment. Remember them. The nameless, fearless ones who turned a fight for survival into a legacy of life, one ember, one breath, one stubborn heartbeat at a time. And Bullen didn't enter the world with a crown on her head, or an army at her feet. Born around 1501, likely at Blickling Hall or Hever Castle, she was the daughter of Thomas Bullen, a sharp-eyed diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, a noblewoman with formidable family ties. In the grand theatre of Tudor society, her birth made barely a ripple. Yet from these modest beginnings, something extraordinary was quietly being set in motion. A life was unfolding, one that would shift the very course of English history. From a young age, Anne Bullen stood apart. Not for riches or noble rank, but for the fire in her mind. She was sharp, quick-witted, and unmistakably captivating. Recognizing this rare spark, her family sent her across the Channel, where her real education began. Her first stop was the court of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands, a dazzling, cultured world where few English girls ever set foot. There, and soaked in the arts of diplomacy and decorum, learning the subtle language of power spoken not in commands, but in gestures, glances, and carefully chosen words. But it was France that truly refined her brilliance. She spent formative years in the glittering courts of Queen Claude and Queen Marguerite of Navarre, places of poetry, elegance, and quiet scheming. While others embroidered flowers into silks, and embroidered strategy into every conversation. She learned how to wield intelligence like a blade and charm like a shield. By the time she returned to England in the early 1520s, and was transformed, not just cultured, but calculated. She possessed the grace of a courtier and the mind of a tactician. She wasn't conventionally beautiful, even her admirers admitted as much, but she had presence. Dark eyes full of mischief and meaning. A voice like music. Movements that hinted at confidence held just below the surface. And didn't simply enter a room. She redefined its center of gravity. In a world where women were expected to marry quietly and vanish into obedience, and refuse to disappear. She had seen the influence women could wield in European courts, and she intended to wield it at home. Still young, still untested, and Bullen was returning not just as Thomas Bullen's daughter, but as a new force entering an old game. History was already shifting around her. When Anne rejoined the English court, she didn't blend in. She was a storm in a garden of roses, electric, unpredictable, impossible to ignore. Among pale, demure noblewomen, and burned with color and energy. She began in the background, as a maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon. But even there, in the Queen's long shadow, and stood out. She danced with poise, spoke fluent French, and laughed with a fearless kind of charm that unsettled and fascinated in equal measure. Men took notice. Women whispered. The court buzzed with the name of the striking Boleyn girl. And soon, she caught the most dangerous gaze of all, the king's. Henry VIII was no stranger to courtly flirtation. His palace was a theater of secret liaisons and whispered pleasures. But Anne didn't play her part the way he expected. She didn't swoon at his compliments. She didn't fall into his arms. She resisted, not with scorn, but with spark. She teased. She challenged. She denied. Henry, a man used to being worshipped, was enthralled. The more Anne held him at a distance, the more obsessed he became. Love letters passed between them, filled with longing, passion, and frustration. Henry offered her the role of mistress, the highest station a woman could hold without a crown. And said no. She would not be a royal ornament, admired and discarded. If he wanted her, truly wanted her, he would have to marry her. It was a move so bold it stunned the entire court. A common knight's daughter asking a king to rewrite his world. But Anne Boleyn wasn't interested in playing the old game. She was about to change the rules forever. After all, the king was already bound by holy vows. His queen, Catherine of Aragon, was no obscure figure. She was cherished by the English people, respected for her dignity, and fiercely protected by her nephew, none other than Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. To marry Anne, Henry would have to do the unthinkable, defy the Church of Rome itself. But Anne didn't tremble. She had walked the polished halls of Europe's great courts, where queens whispered orders behind lace fans and orchestrated politics with painted smiles. She knew power. She understood the cost of ambition, and she was ready to pay it. There, in the flickering candlelight of the English court, Anne Boleyn made her choice. She would not be content with admiration. She would change her fate, and with it, the fate of a kingdom. What began as a flirtation quickly turned into a national crisis. Henry wasn't merely enamored. He was enthralled. And for Anne, he was prepared to upend centuries of English tradition. There was just one obstacle. He was already married. Catherine, graceful and resolute, refused to surrender quietly. She had stood beside Henry for over 20 years. In the eyes of God and the English people, she was the rightful queen, and she intended to remain so. Divorce wasn't just controversial. It was nearly blasphemous. But Henry clung to a new idea. He claimed his marriage to Catherine had always been cursed, that because she had once been married to his older brother Arthur, their union was invalid in God's eyes. Never mind that the Pope had approved it decades ago. Henry now believed that unless the marriage was annulled, his very soul was at risk. Anne, ever the strategist, kept her distance. She did not rush. She stayed just out of reach, warm, encouraging yet elusive. Every word she spoke, every glance she gave, was calculated. She wasn't simply seeking marriage. She was preparing to wear the crown. The court fractured. Rumors whispered through stone corridors. Some nobles scrambled to align with Anne, sensing the winds of change. Others stood defiantly with Queen Catherine, scandalized by Anne's rise. Letters flew across borders. Diplomats pleaded with Rome. Foreign kings issued threats. Even Henry's own advisers began to waver, feeling the earth shift beneath their feet. As the years dragged on, Henry's obsession deepened. He flooded the Pope with petitions. He weaponized his lawyers, searching every legal crevice for a solution. But the Church would not bend. Catherine had powerful allies. Chief among them was her nephew, Emperor Charles V, a man who controlled half of Europe and had little patience for Henry's defiance. Still, Henry pressed forward. He ignored warnings, tradition, and even the law. What had begun as a royal courtship had become a political earthquake. And Boleyn was no longer merely a woman in Henry's life. She was a symbol of radical change, pulling England into uncharted waters. And there would be no going back. After nearly 7 turbulent years of resistance, upheaval, and diplomatic chaos, and Boleyn's gamble finally succeeded. In January 1533, she and Henry were secretly married, a defiant act, as Henry was still officially wed to Catherine in the eyes of the Pope and most of Europe. By June, and was crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. It should have been the climax of her rise, the moment where ambition became triumph. But the mood in London was uneasy. Some in the crowd cheered. Others stood silent, muttering quiet prayers for Queen Catherine. Suspicion lingered in the air. For every noble who celebrated Anne's ascent, there were others who watched with narrowed eyes, waiting for the storm they knew would come. Many questioned whether this new queen, with her French polish and fierce ambition, was England's salvation or its reckoning, and stepped into her role not as a beloved figure, but as a tempest. Unlike Catherine, who had represented quiet strength and traditional virtues, and dazzled with confidence, intelligence, and unapologetic style. She wore daring colors, spoke her mind without fear, and rose swiftly, and dangerously, through the ranks of power. Her grip on the throne was tight, but everyone knew it was built atop fragile ground. Everything depended on one thing, producing a male heir. And understood this more deeply than anyone. She was no longer the flirtatious courtier or the untouchable muse. She was now the vessel of a dynasty's future. And the weight was crushing. When she became pregnant, she and Henry were elated, certain a prince was on the way. But in September 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. And, ever composed, hid her disappointment behind grace, declaring the next child would be a boy. But Henry's gaze, once full of fire, cooled with doubt. Still, Anne's influence reached its height. She remade the court in her image, elevating the Boleyn name to unprecedented heights. She was the first queen crowned with the sacred oil typically reserved for kings. Foreign ambassadors bowed for her favor. Alliances shifted. Henry, once the obedient son of Rome, formally broke from the Catholic Church and created the Church of England, placing himself at its head, just so Anne's crown could not be questioned. But with that crown came whispers. Her allies grew uneasy. Her enemies sharpened their knives. And Henry, restless, moody, and never satisfied, began to glance beyond the queen he had once torn a nation apart to possess. And had conquered the palace, but holding it required more than brilliance, more than charm, more even than love. She had climbed higher than any woman of her generation. But the higher the ascent, the longer the fall. And the cracks had already begun to show. At the heart of Anne's unraveling was the pressure of legacy, the male heir that never came. Elizabeth was brilliant, healthy, vibrant, but she was not a son. And time was slipping away. And became pregnant again. Then again. Each time, hope surged. And each time, heartbreak followed. Miscarriages left her physically drained and emotionally frayed. Her body, once a promise, had become a battlefield. Each loss chipped away at the fragile bridge between her and Henry. The king, once consumed by love, now retreated into distance. Disappointment turned to silence. Admiration became irritation. And, fiery and unyielding, did not wilt. She argued. She confronted. She refused to fade. But Henry, who prized obedience nearly as much as beauty, grew weary of her spirit, the same spirit that had once set his world on fire. And outside the royal chambers, her enemies circled like wolves. Courtiers who had once smiled through gritted teeth now plotted openly. Catherine of Aragon's defenders never forgave, and, believing she had usurped a sacred throne. The common people, too, murmured her name with disdain. They blamed her for the king's break from Rome, for the upheaval in their churches, for the uncertainty that now haunted their lives. And then came Jane Seymour. Quiet. Pale. Obedient. Everything and was not. And just like that, the same king who had shattered empires to make and bullion his queen began to imagine another future, one without her. Quiet, composed, everything and was not, Jane Seymour caught Henry's eye just as Anne's influence began to crumble. Where Anne had once thrilled him with wit and fire, Jane offered the comfort of docile agreement. A soft smile in place of sharp words. It was a subtle, deadly shift, and Anne, perceptive as ever, saw it coming. She tried to win him back. Showered him with affection. Whispered promises of sons. Pleaded for time. But the man who had once rewritten an empire to possess her was now dreaming of a future without her in it. Anne's enemies, ever watchful, sensed their moment. Among them Thomas Cromwell, once her greatest ally, now moved against her. The political tide was shifting, and Cromwell knew how to ride it. Behind closed doors, a quiet conspiracy began to take shape. The queen who had mastered the game of power was suddenly losing her footing, and had reached her throne with brilliance and boldness. But the Tudor court had little use for yesterday's victories. It demanded fresh triumphs, and Anne, exhausted by miscarriage, controversy, and constant pressure, had none left to give. And so, the knives were drawn. They didn't come for her in battle armor, but in hushed conversations, in false confessions, in folded parchments passed in shadow. Cromwell, calculating and precise, built the case. He didn't need facts, only fear. Whispers became charges: adultery, incest, treason, unthinkable accusations. And yet, in Henry's court, they were more than enough. Anne Boleyn, once England's most dazzling queen, was recast overnight as its most dangerous traitor. Cromwell's web ensnared even the innocent. Flirtations twisted into evidence. Confessions wrung out with pain. Loyal men, poets, musicians, friends, were named and seized. Even her brother, George Boleyn, was dragged into the storm. The charges made no sense. Dates didn't match. Witnesses contradicted each other. But logic had long since left the palace. In Henry's eyes, truth was whatever kept his conscience clean and his path to Jane Seymour clear. Anne fought like a queen. She demanded to be heard. She clung to dignity. She reminded Henry of their past, of the kingdom he had shattered for her hand. But the king who once gazed at her with fire in his eyes now would not even meet them. His silence was final. The woman who had redefined queenship, who had challenged church and crown alike, now stood alone, betrayed by those she had elevated, condemned by the man she had loved, and facing the greatest cruelty of all, to be forgotten by the very history she had rewritten. In May of 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested and led through the stone gates of the Tower of London. As the iron doors slammed shut behind her, she understood. She was no longer queen. She was now a prisoner in the very fortress where she had once awaited her coronation. The game she had played so brilliantly had turned against her, and betrayal had written the final move. Within the tower's cold walls, and stood trial in the great hall, facing a tribunal of lords, many of whom owed their titles and fortunes to her meteoric rise. Now they sat cloaked in silence and power, prepared to erase the woman who had once shaped the future of England. The charges hurled at her were breathtaking in their cruelty: adultery with several men, treason against the king, and worst of all, an unthinkable accusation of incest with her own brother, George Boleyn. Once, such claims against the crowned queen would have been unimaginable. Now, they were a carefully staged performance, a deadly theater designed to offer Henry VIII the outcome he craved: Anne's erasure, cloaked in the thin guise of justice. But Anne did not crumble. She met each accusation with clarity, defiance, and poise. Her voice was steady, her mind sharp. She reminded the court that she had been anointed with sacred oil, that she had ruled with loyalty and sacrifice. She spoke of love, duty, and her unwavering commitment to the crown. But the verdict had been carved into stone long before the trial began. Witness after witness, many coerced, many bribed, offered rehearsed condemnations. Timelines conflicted. Evidence was laughably fragile. But the truth no longer mattered. Anne was pronounced guilty. Her brother and the other men accused alongside her were condemned to die as well. Anne's sentence was death by beheading, merciful, they claimed, compared to the gruesome execution given to common traitors. When the verdict was delivered, she did not falter. Her face, though pale, held firm. Her spirit burned bright beneath the weight of injustice. She spoke clearly before being led away, offering forgiveness, praying for mercy, and preparing to meet her end with grace. Her words echoed across the chamber, strong, human, and heartbreakingly composed. And when the great doors closed behind her, the court breathed in relief. The woman they feared, envied, and could never quite control was nearly gone. But they were wrong. Anne Boleyn would not vanish. They weren't erasing her legacy. They were sealing it in legend, forever remembered not as a queen undone, but as a symbol of power, brilliance, and betrayal. Returned to the tower, and waited for the blade. No longer the dazzling queen who had once reshaped a kingdom, she was a condemned woman, confined within cold stone walls. But even here, on the brink of death, Anne remained herself. She spent her final days in prayer, kneeling on hard stone floors, whispering hopes and absolutions with steady breath. She confessed nothing, because in her heart, she believed she had done nothing wrong. She did not fear death. But she prayed that her passing might bring peace to England, and mercy to the tiny daughter she would never hold again, Elizabeth. Her remaining ladies, loyal to the end, wept quietly in her presence. But Anne, ever the flame, offered them comfort instead. She even laughed, dark, ironic humor piercing the gloom, saying she'd be remembered, at least, as the queen who quite literally lost her head. That wit, that unbreakable spark, that was in Bullen, brilliant, bold, and unforgettable, even in the shadow of death. Henry VIII, meanwhile, showed no sign of mercy. His affections had already shifted, his gaze fixed firmly on Jane Seymour. Even before Anne's execution date had been set, the king was making arrangements for his next marriage. For Anne, it must have been the cruelest betrayal of all. The man who had once defied a pope and torn apart a kingdom just to win her hand was now rushing to replace her. On May 18, 1536, and was told she would die the following morning. She did not sleep much that night. Instead, she spent those final hours in solemn prayer, whispering forgiveness for those who had betrayed her, and perhaps for herself, for the ambition, the pride, and the choices that had brought her to this place. In a final gesture of royal favor, or perhaps a pang of guilty conscience, Henry ordered that a French swordsman be brought in to perform the execution. Swift, clean, and far less brutal than the English axe, it was a small mercy purchased more for the king's image than for Anne's comfort. At dawn, and dressed with care, as if for a final royal appearance, she wore a dark grey damask gown lined with fur and a deep crimson underdress, colors of dignity, of sacrifice, of quiet defiance. Her dark hair was pinned neatly beneath a simple coif. She was ready. Ready to meet death with the same fierce composure with which she had lived. As the cold mist curled around the tower of London's stone courtyard, and Bullen, Queen, Mother, Survivor, stepped forward into history, there were no tears, no pleas for mercy. Just silence, resolve, and the quiet steps of a woman facing her fate head-on. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne climbed the scaffold erected within the tower grounds. A small crowd had gathered, guards, nobles, courtiers, silent spectators. Even the wind seemed to pause. Anne stood tall, her grey gown catching the breeze, her frame thinner than it had been at court, her face pale but calm. There was no hysteria, no sobbing, no collapse. She faced her death with the same bold dignity that had once shaken the very throne of England, and spoke only briefly. She made no accusations. She offered no defense. Instead, she prayed for the king's health and future, the very man who had abandoned her. In those final breaths, she chose forgiveness over fury. Her poise shocked even her executioners. The French swordsman, specially summoned for the task, stepped forward and knelt upright, hands folded in prayer, eyes lifted to the grey morning sky. A white cloth was gently tied over her eyes. She did not flinch. She did not tremble. The sword flashed. Silent. Swift. And Bullen, queen, reformer, mother of a future legend, was gone. Her body was buried quickly within the tower's chapel grounds. No grand tomb. No royal procession. She was placed in an arrow chest, unfit even for a coffin. The queen once crowned with sacred oil now laid to rest with barely a whisper. But Anne's story did not end in that unmarked grave. Her daughter, Elizabeth, the child whose birth had disappointed a king, would rise to become one of the greatest monarchs in English history. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. Her reign would ignite the golden age of English culture, naval triumph, and global influence. A queen who inherited her mother's brilliant mind, her fire, her resilience. And Boleyn changed the course of history. Her ambition helped fracture the power of Rome. Her fall reminded the world that no one, not even a queen, was safe from politics and pride. But her legacy endured. Through Elizabeth, Anne's name would blaze brighter than any jeweled crown. Not because she survived, but because her spirit did. In the end, Anne Boleyn won something far greater than a throne. She won immortality. By the early 1770s, the American colonies simmered like a kettle left too long over an open flame. What had once been a bond of pride between the colonies and their mother country had curdled into distrust, frustration, and a rising fury. This wasn't about tea, not yet. The real trouble had started years earlier. When Parliament passed the Stamp Act, colonists were outraged. Every legal document, newspaper, even playing card was suddenly taxed. It was more than ink and paper, it was control. Then came the Townshend Acts, targeting essentials like paper, glass, and paint. These laws, written thousands of miles away by a body where colonists had no voice, felt like sparks tossed into dry kindling. At first, the resistance was measured. Colonial assemblies sent formal letters. Newspapers printed fiery essays. Merchants began to boycott British goods. Figures like Samuel Adams and John Dickinson penned stirring arguments about liberty and natural rights. But slowly it became clear Britain wasn't listening. Worse, it didn't care. Some colonists clung to hope. Perhaps if they protested loudly enough, Parliament would repeal the laws. And sometimes it did. The Stamp Act was repealed after massive outcry. But every small victory was followed by a new insult. A new law. A new tax. It was never really about the money. British citizens at home paid far more. What enraged the colonists was the principle. They were being taxed without representation, treated not as equals, but as property. They weren't partners in an empire. They were subjects to be managed. Boston became the heart of the storm. The Sons of Liberty, a clandestine group of radical patriots, grew bolder by the day. In 1770, tensions boiled over. British soldiers fired into a crowd of civilians on a cold March night. The Boston Massacre, they called it. Blood stained the cobblestones. Trust was shattered. By 1773, the colonies stood on the edge. It would take only one more spark to ignite full-blown rebellion. That spark arrived quietly, tucked inside wooden crates filled with tea. Parliament had miscalculated. They believed a simple economic fix, the Tea Act, would smooth things over. Passed in 1773, the law allowed the British East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonies, bypassing colonial merchants and offering lower prices. On paper, it was a bargain, cheaper tea, direct trade, problem solved. But colonists saw it for what it was, a trap. The Tea Act preserved the hated tax. Accepting the tea meant accepting Parliament's right to tax them without consent. For patriots who had spent more than a decade resisting that very idea, the price of tea, no matter how low, was irrelevant. It was about dignity. About rights. About freedom. News of the act spread rapidly. Outrage followed. Merchants feared their businesses would collapse under a government-backed monopoly. Patriots warned that liberty was being bought and sold in porcelain cups. To them, accepting the tea was the same as surrendering. Boston, already a city scarred by violence and economic strain, burned with resistance. The Tea Act was not a gift, it was an insult wrapped in velvet. Bostonians understood that this was a test. Would they yield to the crown? Or would they draw a line? Refusing the tea became a badge of honor. Public meetings overflowed with protesters. Pamphlets flew like sparks in a dry wind. Words like tyranny and oppression now filled taverns, churches, and town squares. And in the shadows, plans were already being made. The crates of tea may have arrived quietly, but their fate would be anything but. History was no longer waiting. It was preparing to leap into action. Newspapers flared with fiery rhetoric, and voices of defiance grew louder with every column printed. In the streets and taverns of Boston, the Sons of Liberty, led by men like Samuel Adams, mobilized resistance with unwavering intensity. They vowed that no tea from the East India Company would touch American soil, much less be sold or sipped. Across the colonies, ships carrying the controversial cargo were turned away, met by a wall of protests from furious citizens. From New York to Charleston, the message was unshakable. We will not be bought. But Boston's fate would unfold differently. 3 British ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, arrived under heavy watch and dropped anchor in Boston Harbor. They refused to leave. Royal officials demanded the cargo be unloaded. Colonists stood their ground and refused. The stalemate stretched on, taut as a drawn bow. And with each passing day, the tension escalated to a near breaking point. One spark, and the course of history would forever change. As the ships remained moored, unmoving, Boston itself transformed into a powder keg. With each tick of the clock, the city edged closer to open revolt. The debates spilled out of Parliament houses and into taverns, meeting halls, and churches. Every cobblestone street echoed with anxious steps and heated arguments. The Sons of Liberty knew that time was running out. They printed broadsides. They gathered crowds. Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere stoked the fires of rebellion, speaking to overflowing crowds. They called for boycotts. They denounced tyranny. The South Meeting House became the headquarters of resistance. Thousands packed into its wooden walls. Merchants, laborers, farmers, mothers, breath fogging in the cold air, voices thundering in defiance. Each vote passed in that building was a hammer blow against British authority. But the window for action was closing. According to British law, all imported goods, tea among them, had to be unloaded and taxed within 20 days of a ship's arrival. If that didn't happen, customs officials had the power to seize the cargo, and British soldiers could enforce the law. The Sons of Liberty knew this wasn't just about crates of tea anymore. If the tea was brought ashore, even under protest, the colonies would be accepting British dominance in principle. And once that principle was lost, their entire argument for self-governance would crumble. Meanwhile, Governor Thomas Hutchinson, unwavering and loyal to the Crown, refused to let the ships sail away. He demanded obedience to the law, colonial fury be damned. To him, bowing to popular anger was surrendering rule to mobs. And so, the standoff deepened. Boston became a spectacle of suspense. Everyone felt it, every man, every woman, even children sensed the storm that gathered over the city. The air itself seemed sharper, heavier. A hush fell over conversations. A reckoning loomed just beyond the horizon. And in quiet corners, behind closed doors, a decision began to take shape. A plan. One that would ignite not just a harbor, but a revolution. The morning of December 16th, 1773, broke gray and cold. For nearly 3 weeks, the tea ships had loomed in Boston Harbor like floating threats. The deadline had arrived. By British law, the tea had to be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days. If not, customs agents would seize it, and British troops would enforce the mandate. Everyone knew what that meant. If the tea came ashore, the colonists' stand for liberty would be forever compromised. If even one crate touched the dock, their protests, their claims to representation, their very identity as free men and women would begin to unravel. And so the city held its breath, because by nightfall, Boston would make a choice that would echo through empires. That morning, thousands of Bostonians and neighboring colonists poured into the Old South Meeting House, the largest building in town. Some trudged for miles across frozen ground just to be present. The crowd spilled beyond the doors and into the streets, shoulder to shoulder, straining to hear the firestorm of speeches echoing from within those timbered walls. At the heart of it all stood Samuel Adams, the unflinching voice of rebellion. He presided over the assembly with the gravitas of a man who knew history was shifting underfoot. One after another, speakers rose to denounce the Tea Act, to rail against tyranny, and to demand action, not later, but now. Still, beneath the storm of words hung a heavy silence. A question pulsed through the crowd like a heartbeat. What can be done that won't plunge us into war? How do we resist without breaking the world apart? Then came the riders, mud-splattered, breathless, bearing grim news. Governor Thomas Hutchinson would not yield. The ships in the harbor would not be allowed to sail without unloading. The tea would be seized. The tax would be collected. The king's law would be enforced. A growl of anger rolled through the hall. The walls of the meeting house quivered under the force of so many clenched fists and pounding hearts. Then Samuel Adams stood once more and declared a single, sharp sentence. "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." Simple. Measured. But to those gathered, it thundered like a call to arms. Outside, as the late afternoon dimmed into dusk, a wild war cry split the air. A signal. Men disappeared into alleyways, only to re-emerge moments later, faces blackened with soot, cloaked in blankets, adorned with feathers. Not true disguises, but symbols. Symbols of resistance. Of transformation. Of defiance. They weren't pretending to be Mohawks. They were telling the world they had shed their colonial skin. As twilight deepened on that cold December night in 1773, Boston's quiet lanes came alive with purpose. Dozens of men moved through the shadows toward Griffin's Wharf, where 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, bobbed gently on black water. The harbor wind cut like a blade. The air was brittle, the tension electric. But there was no chaos. No shouting. This was no drunken riot. It was an operation, disciplined, deliberate, and coldly efficient. Armed with hatchets, mallets, and clubs, the masked patriots stormed the ships. The few crewmen who remained were brushed aside unhurt, told only to stand down. They watched in stunned silence as the work began. Wooden chests were split open, the smell of fresh tea flooding the night like incense at a funeral. One by one, the crates were hurled into the harbor. Splash after splash after splash. 342 in all. A tidal wave of protest that sent British tea to a watery grave. Spectators lined the wharf in breathless silence. British guards looked on from nearby posts and did nothing. Whether paralyzed by confusion, quietly sympathetic, or simply afraid of the consequences, no one moved to stop it. Not that night. Even loyalists, it said, felt something shifting, something irreversible. And yet, amid the chaos, the discipline was extraordinary. No loot was taken. No property destroyed. Not a single crate was kept. They touched only what they came to destroy, the tea. The symbol of control. The emblem of an empire's overreach. By the time the last chest hit the harbor, the surface churned with leaves, black, bitter, floating like ashes on a funeral pyre. Boston had spoken. Not with words, but with action. And the world would never be the same. In a city where hunger lingered in every alley and hardship weighed on every household, the men who marched to the harbor could have easily turned protest into plunder. But they didn't. Not one chest of tea was taken for personal gain. Not one item from the ships was pocketed or hidden. When the night's work was done, Boston Harbor resembled a massive, swirling brew, crates shattered, tea leaves soaked and drifting like seaweed, the water stained a deep, inky black. The sharp scent of torn tea mixed with the salt air, rising over the wharf in a strange, bittersweet perfume. It was not the smell of violence. It was the scent of resolve. And then, just as silently as they had come, the men vanished into the cold Boston night, through side streets, back alleys, and shuttered doors. No names were spoken. No leaders claimed credit. They left behind only the unmistakable footprint of revolution. As the last tea chest bobbed in the harbor's cold embrace, Boston seemed to exhale, the city holding its breath after the storm. This was not a riot. It was no drunken mob. This was rebellion by design, a calculated, disciplined act of defiance executed beneath the veil of night. The harbor had become a vast teapot, steeping in symbolism. Thousands of pounds of East India Company tea floated like dark petals, spreading out in thick, black mats. Some onlookers, drawn by curiosity or boldness, reached into the icy water to scoop up the soggy leaves, only to be stopped by Sons of Liberty standing watch. Nothing was to be salvaged. No part of the protest would be repurposed or sold. This was not for profit. This was for principle. When dawn broke over Boston the next day, it brought with it the strange smell of salted tea wafting through the streets like incense after a ritual. The city woke not to gunfire or alarms, but to whispers, gasps, and then rising voices. Words spread like wildfire. Something extraordinary had happened. By midday, the news had reached every tavern, every parlor, every dock and marketplace. Apprentices whispered it to merchants. Housewives repeated it to their neighbors. The story flew from rooftop to harbor in hours. And with it came division. To patriots, it was a moment of thunderous pride. Ordinary men had stood toe-to-toe with the world's greatest empire, and made their mark. A line had been drawn, not in ink or petition, but in salt water and splintered oak. This was not just protest. This was the spark of liberty. To loyalists and moderates, it was a chilling act of lawlessness. What began as resistance now teetered on the edge of rebellion. Had the colonies gone too far? Could they walk this back, or had the rope been pulled taut? Governor Thomas Hutchinson paced in his mansion, livid. It wasn't only the destruction of valuable cargo that infuriated him, it was the brazenness. If royal authority could be challenged so openly here, in Boston, what would stop it from unraveling everywhere? British officials were dumbfounded. They had anticipated more noise, perhaps some vandalism or another unruly crowd like those during the Stamp Act protests. But this precise, organized destruction, carried out with calm fury and surgical discipline, was unlike anything they had prepared for. The captains of the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver could do nothing but watch as their precious cargo sank beneath the cold surface. They had been caught in the middle of something far larger than trade disputes or taxes. This was no longer about tea. This was the beginning of something far more profound. This was revolution. In the official ledgers of the British Crown, the damage was recorded as a staggering loss, over £10,000 worth of tea, a fortune by any measure. But the true cost of that fateful night in Boston couldn't be counted in pounds or shattered crates. The deeper loss was intangible: trust, loyalty, the fragile illusion that Britain still ruled its colonies with consent rather than coercion. As the tea leaves sank beneath the harbor's surface, something far more powerful rose in their place: a shared, undeniable truth. The age of polite protest had ended. A reckoning was coming, and Boston would be its spark. When word of the Boston Tea Party crossed the Atlantic and reached London, the reaction was swift and blistering. To British officials, this wasn't just vandalism, it was rebellion. An open, deliberate insult to royal authority. King George III, upon hearing the news, reportedly turned icy with rage. Parliament, already seething from years of defiance across the ocean, exploded into fury. They demanded retribution, not only for Boston but as a stern warning to all 13 colonies. The response came in the form of punishment wrapped in law, a brutal package of legislation so severe that American patriots quickly gave them a fitting name: the Intolerable Acts. The first blow landed quickly: the Boston Port Act. In a single sweeping decree, Parliament shut down Boston's bustling harbor, its economic heartbeat, until the destroyed tea was paid for, and the colony fell back in line. No ships in, no ships out. Trade vanished. The hum of commerce went silent. The wharves, once crowded with shouting dockworkers and creaking cargo, now sat cold and still. But that was only the beginning. The Massachusetts Government Act followed, tearing away the colony's right to self-rule. Elected leaders were replaced with royal appointees loyal to the king. The Administration of Justice Act ensured that any British official accused of wrongdoing could be sent back to Britain for trial, effectively placing them above colonial law. And to remind the people of Boston that the king's power was not just legal, but physical, soldiers were quartered in their homes, eating at their tables, sleeping under their roofs. The message was unmistakable: rebellion would be met with steel. Liberty was no longer a right, it was a threat. But Parliament had miscalculated. What they hoped would terrify the colonies instead united them. The punishment of Boston lit a fire that no decree could extinguish. News of the city's suffering spread rapidly, its ports sealed, its streets patrolled, its people crushed under martial law. But instead of silence, Boston's hardship stirred an outpouring of sympathy and fury. Neighboring colonies sent food, supplies, and heartfelt letters of support. Secret meetings multiplied. Public declarations of unity emerged. What had once been seen as a Massachusetts problem quickly transformed into an American crisis. In trying to make an example of Boston, Britain had created a symbol, a rallying cry. The flames of revolution, once flickering in the shadows of backroom taverns and quiet town halls, now roared from village to village, colony to colony. And they would not be easily extinguished. The backlash stretched far beyond Massachusetts. Across all 13 colonies, something long feared in London began to take shape: unity. For decades, the American colonies had behaved like estranged relatives, divided by economy and culture. They bickered over trade, disputed over religion, and competed like rival siblings. But when Britain closed Boston's harbor and stripped its government bare, a chilling truth settled over the land. If it could happen to Boston, it could happen to anyone from the plantations of Virginia to the shipyards of Philadelphia, from the Carolinas to the granite hills of New Hampshire. A new determination took root. It was no longer a question of whether the colonies would resist. The only question now was when. And how. Colonists sent wagons laden with food, crates of supplies, and letters of unwavering solidarity to the besieged people of Boston. Town meetings buzzed like beehives with righteous anger. In print shops, ink-stained hands worked late into the night to set the type, press after press pounding out the truth. The fight was no longer Boston's burden. It had become everyone's cause. And so, in September of 1774, something unprecedented occurred. Representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. It was more than a political meeting. It was the first heartbeat of a new nation. George Washington, Patrick Henry, John Adams, Samuel Adams, once regional voices, now stood shoulder to shoulder as architects of something larger than any single colony. Their mission, at least officially, wasn't independence. Most still hoped for reconciliation, a restoration of mutual respect under the British Crown. But beneath the carefully crafted speeches and petitions, another truth simmered: the colonies could no longer afford to stand alone. At that Congress, they agreed to a sweeping boycott of British goods and pledged mutual protection. They made a bold declaration: if any one colony was attacked, all would rise to defend it. Across taverns and town halls, once whispered words rang louder: unity, resistance, liberty. In crushing Boston, Britain believed it would extinguish rebellion. Instead, it had forged unity, transforming scattered colonies into something far more dangerous: a people who had begun to think of themselves not as British subjects, but as Americans. The winds of revolution were no longer stirring quietly in the corners. They were howling now, unstoppable and sharp. The storm had gathered, and it was too late for Britain to hold it back. The night the tea sank into Boston Harbor, it wasn't just crates that vanished beneath the waves. It was the illusion of peaceful submission. That single act of defiance ignited a flame that no monarch, no army, no faraway parliament could hope to smother. In the months that followed, that flame became a blaze. Protests and pamphlets gave way to gunpowder and preparation. Town militias trained openly. Barns became armories. Barrels of powder and musket shot were tucked into cellars and hidden behind church pews. Men who once lifted their mugs to King George III now gathered in corners to speak of revolution. Boston became more than a city, it became a symbol. Battered but unbowed. The harder Britain squeezed, the more the colonies slipped through her grasp. Every ship that sailed past Boston's silent, shuttered harbor became a silent witness. Tyranny had met its match. What Parliament meant to use as an example had instead become a banner. Boston, the martyr city, unyielding in defiance. From the swamps of Georgia to the rocky shores of New Hampshire, colonists came to the same realization: their fates were bound together. This wasn't about tea anymore. This was about survival. Identity. Freedom. By the spring of 1775, the powder keg was ready to burst. Outside Boston, in the small villages of Lexington and Concord, the British sent troops to seize hidden colonial arms. But instead of finding cowed farmers, they were met with defiance. Ordinary men, muskets in hand, standing shoulder to shoulder on village greens. The first shots of the American Revolution would soon be fired, not by generals, but by neighbors, farmers, and tradesmen who had finally decided that enough was enough. The revolution had arrived, and there would be no turning back. The first shots of the American Revolution echoed across fields of New England, but their origin could be traced back to a quieter night, when patriots chose principle over profit and sent a fortune's worth of tea into the depths of Boston Harbor. The Boston Tea Party wasn't the start of revolution, it was its declaration. It showed the world that revolutions don't always begin with blaring trumpets or waving flags. Sometimes they start in silence, with a group of ordinary people standing shoulder to shoulder in the cold, choosing defiance over fear. By dumping the tea, the colonists weren't just rejecting a tax, they were rejecting an empire. And though the path ahead would be long, bloody, and uncertain, one truth rang clear from that dark harbor: the American colonies were no longer just subjects of the crown. They were becoming something new, something dangerous. They were revolutionaries, and they were just getting started. But before that spark of defiance in the New World, before the towering pyramids of Giza, before the bustling cities of Mesopotamia or the stones of Stonehenge were raised against the sky, there was Carol. Tucked away in the arid valleys of coastal Peru, Carol emerged nearly 5,000 years ago. Then, like a breath drawn in and held too long, it disappeared. Swallowed by the sands and forgotten by time. The Soup Valley, where Carol once thrived, seems at first glance an unlikely cradle of civilization. The land is dry, cracked, and barren. The river that snakes through it barely cuts the dust. To most, it looked abandoned by life itself. And yet, it was here, in a place where survival seemed improbable, that one of humanity's earliest cities took root. Carol was not a scattering of huts or a roadside market. It was a planned metropolis, sprawling over 150 acres. Its landscape was marked by stepped pyramids, sunken plazas, residences, and sacred ceremonial grounds. It had symmetry, structure, vision. A society that rose centuries before the Egyptians placed their first stone at Giza. What makes Carol's achievement even more astonishing is what it lacked. No wheels. No metal tools. No written language. Yet with only stone, sand, and sheer determination, its people built wonders. Monumental structures rose from the valley floor, not through conquest, but through cooperation, a community built not on warfare, but unity. For thousands of years, Carol remained hidden in plain sight. Travelers passed through the valley, dismissing the mounds as natural hills shaped by wind and time. They walked among the bones of a forgotten empire and never knew. Then, In the late 20th century, Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady and her team began to dig. What they uncovered would upend history. Beneath layers of sand and silence, they unearthed a city older than Egypt, older than Sumer, a civilization that predated the supposed firsts of the ancient world. Carroll rewrote the narrative of the Americas. It reminded us that the story of civilization is not a straight line that began in the Middle East and moved westward. It is a constellation, with points of brilliance shining in every corner of the globe. Carroll had risen, flourished, and fallen without ever making a sound in the annals of human memory. But now, its silence has been broken. Its stone walls speak again, of a people who defied the desert and built a world of meaning and majesty in a place where few believed life could even exist. And perhaps, that's the greatest legacy of Carroll. Long before kings or pharaohs, long before war defined power, there was a peaceful city built on cooperation and imagination. A reminder that the roots of civilization run deeper and stretch farther than we ever dared believe. And this is only the beginning. At first glance, the Soup Valley appears to be a place life should avoid. Harsh desert winds sweep across endless stretches of cracked earth and ancient stone. The sun bears down relentlessly, baking the landscape into a brittle canvas of dust and silence. Water, the elixir of civilization, is scarce, just a thin silver thread winding through the valley like a forgotten memory. To most, this is a wasteland. Lifeless. Barren. Abandoned by the gods. But to the people of Carroll, it was potential. Where others saw emptiness, they saw a canvas waiting to be shaped. They looked not with fear, but with vision. They recognized the humble river, fragile though it was, as the lifeblood of a future yet to be written. And so, through patience, brilliance, and the unshakable will of a united people, they transformed desolation into a cradle of civilization. Their first conquest was not over rival tribes, but over the land itself. They tamed the river's seasonal floods with ingeniously simple irrigation systems, coaxing water across the valley floor to breathe life into the dust. Where there was once only sand, green life sprouted: cotton, beans, squash, guava, and sweet potatoes. Of these, cotton became a treasure. It was more than fabric, it became trade. Spun into fine nets, it connected Carroll to coastal fishing villages and formed the threads of a growing economic network. This was not isolation, it was integration. And survival wasn't just about food. The people of Carroll understood balance. They didn't dominate nature, they cooperated with it. Their homes and plazas were built from stone and earth, designed with care to endure both blistering heat and the rare but brutal rains. They studied the stars and tracked the rhythms of the seasons, aligning their planting with cosmic patterns. They were not simply farmers. They were astronomers, architects, and engineers. Trade became Carroll's heartbeat. Dried fish, fruit, and hand-woven goods flowed across the region, and in return came rare shells from the Pacific, colorful feathers, and stones from the distant Andes. They were not a lonely desert people. They were part of something bigger, a network of ancient connections humming with ideas and exchange. In a place where life should have withered, Carroll thrived, not with conquest, but with community. They didn't build a city through brute force. They built it through wisdom, resilience, and harmony. And from this spirit Carroll rose. Out of the arid earth, their pyramids climbed skyward like ancient guardians, towering over the valley with quiet defiance. These weren't crude shelters. These were monumental achievements, designed with intention, raised by a people who believed not only in survival, but in legacy. The heart of the city was the Pyramid Mayor, a colossal structure stretching over 450 feet long and standing nearly 60 feet high. Constructed from stone, adobe, and countless woven reed bags filled with rubble, it was a triumph of design. Not only was it engineered to endure the region's punishing sun, it was built to withstand the earthquakes that sometimes shattered the earth beneath it. And withstand them it did. For nearly 5,000 years, it stood silent, watching the desert change, while it remained unchanged. Yet these pyramids were not tombs. Unlike the grand funerary complexes of Egypt, Carol's pyramids were places of life, of ceremony, of community. At their summits were temples, plazas, and gathering spaces, platforms where priests, leaders, and citizens alike could witness ritual and meaning in the open sky. Broad staircases rose with grace, inviting people upward, not toward death, but toward shared experience. These structures weren't meant to guard the past. They were built to shape the present. It rose out of the most unlikely soil, not just to survive, but to inspire. And its story, long buried beneath the desert sands, is only now beginning to be heard. Fires once danced atop the sacred platforms, casting flickering light beneath the endless canvas of the Peruvian sky. Below, vast circular plazas stretched out at the feet of the pyramids, sunken, intentional spaces where thousands could gather. Here, the people met not just to worship, but to govern, to celebrate, to remember who they were and why they had come together. These were not just buildings, they were invitations to unity. The very layout of Carol echoed something profound, a civilization that valued structure, order, and the interconnectedness of all things. It was a city designed not only for function but for meaning, a reflection of the cosmos carved into stone. Around the mighty pyramids, residential complexes fanned outward in careful symmetry. These were likely homes to priests, artisans, administrators, and farmers, each role distinct, yet inseparable in the fabric of community life. The pyramids themselves weren't placed randomly. They aligned with celestial rhythms, sunrises, solstices, the dance of distant stars. To the people of Carol, architecture was more than utility. It was spiritual geometry, a way to anchor themselves to the heavens. Wander through the ruins today and you feel it, the reverence in every cut stone, the silence that hums with memory. These monuments were built without iron tools, without wheels, without beasts of burden. Yet they rose with impossible precision, symmetry, and grace. They weren't built to impress conquerors. They weren't built for tombs or warfare. They were built to link the earth to the sky, the soul to the universe. And still, across time and shifting sands, they whisper. What makes Carol truly remarkable isn't just what was built, but what wasn't. No swords. No shields. No defensive walls. No evidence of armies or mass graves. In a world where ancient power so often came from war, Carol broke the pattern. This was a society not forged in violence, but in peace. It's a revelation that rewrites everything we think we know about early civilization. While other great cultures rose through blood and conquest, Carol flourished through trade, community, and belief. Its people poured their energies not into destruction, but into astronomy, music, urban design, and ceremony. Their plazas were gathering spaces, not battlegrounds. Their pyramids rose not in dominance, but in reverence. This was a place where the purpose of civilization was to come together, not to divide. Trade was the artery through which Cairo pulsed with life. Along the fertile banks of the river, they cultivated cotton, threaded it into fishing nets, and traded those nets with coastal communities. In return came dried fish, rich in protein, and goods from faraway lands, colorful shells from the Pacific, gleaming stones from the Andean highlands, rare fruits from lush valleys. These trade routes formed a web of connection, a quiet, intricate network of exchange that stitched together dozens of cultures in mutual respect. And at the center of this web stood Cairo, a beacon of peace and possibility. Religion and ritual gave rhythm to Cairo's life. The city's grand spaces weren't just for politics or commerce. They were sacred theaters for communal ritual. Sunken plazas likely hosted ceremonies filled with music and spirit, flutes carved from the bones of condors, drums stretched from deer hide, resonating across the stones and into the sky. In those echoes, the people heard the heartbeat of something larger than themselves. Even leadership in Cairo reflected this commitment to harmony. There are no grand monuments to warlords here. Power seems to have flowed from spiritual wisdom and civic responsibility, not brute force. It's this difference, this gentleness wrapped in strength, that sets Cairo apart. While the world remembers empires that conquered, Cairo stands as a rare and radiant alternative, a civilization that chose balance over battle, beauty over bloodshed. Cairo didn't just survive. It transcended. The leaders of Cairo must have commanded an astonishing level of coordination. Massive building projects, agricultural cycles tuned to the shifting seasons, and expansive trade routes, all organized with precision. Yet unlike many ancient centers of power, Cairo bore no scars of conquest. No battlefields. No shattered fortresses. It was not power forged in fire and steel, but in consensus, creativity, and trust. In a world so often carved by war, Cairo stands alone, an ancient city that rose not through domination, but through collaboration. It is a quiet monument to what human civilization can be when it chooses peace over plunder. Today, the stones still seem to hum. Not with violence, but with music. Cairo wasn't merely a place of commerce and planning, it was a living rhythm. Sound and spirit wove through the very fabric of the city, its plazas resonating with ceremonies and celebration. Archaeologists, sifting through the sands of time, unearthed astonishing relics of this harmony. Flutes carved from the bones of condors and pelicans, delicate whistles made from deer antlers, and drums stretched with animal hide. These were not crude instruments. They were tuned with precision, designed to carry melody across open plazas, echoing from the stone pyramids. In a culture without written language, music spoke where words could not. Picture it. Drums pulsing like a second heartbeat beneath the stars, flutes rising in keening harmony with the desert wind. On the great sunken courts, feet stomped in rhythm, voices lifted in prayer. Fires burned at the tops of the pyramids as priests, cloaked in intricate woven robes, offered chants to the spirits of the earth, the rivers, the sky. In these moments, Cairo became more than stone and sand. It was a living symphony, people and place moving in celestial time. The very design of the city reflects this sacred intention. Grand plazas weren't empty spaces. They were ceremonial stages, geometrically aligned and acoustically tuned to pull a crowd into unity. The circular courts functioned like ancient amphitheaters, focusing the energy of sound and ritual. The pyramids above stood not as tombs, but as altars, sacred mountains raised by human hands to bridge the earth and heavens. Their ceremonies likely mark seasonal change, harvest cycles, solstices, celestial alignments. Music wasn't just art, it was connection. A sacred thread tying individuals to one another, to nature, and to something eternal beyond the stars. And what's most striking? Carol offers no murals of battle. No fearsome gods wielding weapons. No signs of human sacrifice. Here, the divine seemed to ask not for blood, but for beauty, reverence, celebration. Even today, when the wind sweeps through the ruins, it's easy to imagine it, faint notes on the breeze, the distant echo of a drumbeat long faded. These were the forgotten songs of a people who found connection in silence, in starlight, in music and meaning drawn from dust. Carol was more than ritual. It was an engineering marvel, an architectural triumph forged without the wheel, without iron tools, without pack animals. Their ingenuity defied logic. The great pyramids weren't stacked with fragile bricks. They were built from enormous stones, hauled across the valley in reed baskets, woven carriers crafted from riverside plants, engineered to transport weight across brutal terrain. Layer upon layer, they built with discipline, packing stone and rubble in a way that resisted the fury of time and the tremble of earthquakes. They didn't just build in defiance of the desert, they understood the desert. They listened to its rhythms, worked with its limitations, and turned what looked like a wasteland into a thriving epicenter of life. And in the quiet moments among its ruins, you can still hear it, the pulse of drums, the whisper of the wind, the silent song of a civilization that chose harmony over havoc, and left a legacy that time itself could not bury. Carol rests in a land shaped by violent tectonic moods, where earthquakes have long been both threat and teacher. And yet the pyramids of Carol still stand, remarkably intact after thousands of years. How? Not by chance, but by wisdom. The builders of Carol had no books, no blueprints. But they had the earth. And they listened to it. Their architecture was not just beautiful, it was resilient. They engineered their monuments with wide, stable foundations, layered filled to cushion vibrations, and subtly curved corners that dispersed seismic force like ripples in a pond. This was earthquake-resistant design born not in theory, but in intimate relationship with nature's fury. And just as they learned to master the ground, they also mastered the lifeblood of the desert, water. Despite their arid surroundings, the people of Carol designed irrigation systems that channeled every precious drop from the river through fields and terraces. Not a single stream was squandered. They cultivated crops during dry spells, turning dust into green abundance. Every drop mattered. Every channel spoke of foresight. Even the city's shape was a kind of language, its plazas and pyramids aligned with celestial rhythms. The sun, the solstices, the stars, all mirrored in stone. These weren't just temples or markets. They were timekeepers. Tools of survival that helped priests and astronomers predict planting, harvest, flood, and drought. The layout revealed a society that understood harmony, not just with the cosmos, but within itself. Residential quarters lay beside ceremonial spaces. Administrative zones nestled near public gathering grounds. A balance of sacred and civic, community, and ritual. They built for their future, for generations yet unborn. Today, when modern architects study Carroll's enduring structures, they're humbled. These people achieved durability and grace without concrete, steel, or machines. Their secret? Understanding the land, honoring its rhythms, working with it, not against it. Their city withstood storms. It survived tremors. It outlasted empires. Carroll is a testament not just to survival, but to wisdom carved into the bones of the earth. For centuries, Carroll thrived in the desert, a radiant hub of culture, trade, music, and peace. And then, suddenly, silently, it vanished. There was no fire, no invasion. No walls smashed by enemy hammers. No bones buried in hurried graves. Just a quiet departure. The flutes stopped. The plazas emptied. The pyramids, once the heart of ceremony, were left to the sands. Why? The mystery lingers in the dry air of the Soup Valley. Some scholars point to climate. There are hints of a long drought that may have pushed Carroll to its limits. Without water, fields of cotton and guava would have failed. The irrigation channels, brilliant though they were, could not summon rain. As crops withered, so did trade. Carroll, once a prosperous node in a thriving network, may have found itself cut off, unable to give, and with little left to receive. Others suggest economic eclipse. Neighboring cultures were growing. Trade routes were shifting like the tides. What Carroll once offered, cotton, dried fish, produce, might have lost its value. And without demand, the arteries of commerce slowly closed. But if Carroll fell, it didn't fall in flames. It faded. Gradually. Families leaving one by one, seeking softer soil, fuller rivers, gentler seasons. What remained were empty temples, silent plazas, and pyramids watching over the desert like forgotten sentinels. The people of Carroll left no epic poems, no carved chronicles. But their city speaks. In every staircase. In every sunken court. In every silence that echoes between the stones. It tells us that peace is possible. That cities can rise not with swords, but with song. And that even in the harshest places, civilization can bloom with balance, grace, and awe. Children once raced across Carroll's great plazas, their footsteps echoing between pyramids and plazas, their laughter chasing the wind. And when they left, they carried with them stories, fragments of memory passed from generation to generation. Stories of a city now lost behind them. Over time, those stories faded into legend. And the desert, patient and eternal, began its quiet work. Winds swept over stone and silence. Grains of sand carried like whispers, slowly buried temples and plazas. Ancient flutes lay hidden beneath the shifting dunes. A vibrant civilization that once pulsed with music and meaning faded into a sleeping landscape of silent, rounded mounds. For nearly 4,000 years, Carroll vanished from human memory, its name unspoken, its wonders buried beneath time. But it was never truly gone. It waited, a whisper beneath the sand, dreaming in the stillness of the Soup Valley. Today, as archaeologists carefully lift each grain of dust, one question continues to burn with quiet urgency. How could a city so advanced, so beautifully designed, simply disappear? Perhaps this is the nature of even the greatest civilizations. No matter how wise, how peaceful, they remain fragile, threads woven into the vast tapestry of time, always vulnerable to the invisible hands of change. For millennia, Carol lay forgotten beneath the pale desert sun. Travelers passed the strange, rounded hills that dotted the valley, never guessing they walked atop buried pyramids, lost plazas, forgotten temples. They thought them hills shaped by wind, nothing more. Nature's humps, not history's voice. It wasn't until the late 20th century that Carol would awaken. In the 1990s, a Peruvian archaeologist named Ruth Shady led a team into the Soup Valley, guided by intuition, persistence, and a deep curiosity. She believed these hills held secrets, secrets that could rewrite the past. And she was right. Layer by delicate layer, they brushed away centuries of sand. Beneath it, the city revealed itself. Stone walls carved with precision, broad staircases, deep ceremonial plazas, pyramids rising from the earth like the backs of ancient gods. What they had uncovered was no minor outpost, it was a metropolis. A city older than anyone dared believe. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the impossible. Carol was over 600 years old. It had thrived at the same time as the earliest civilizations in Egypt and Mesopotamia, contemporaries separated by oceans but bound by the shared miracle of human ingenuity. This discovery sent shockwaves through the world of archaeology. Until then, the Americas had been thought to lag behind the ancient world's great cities. But Carol shattered that illusion. It proved that in the quiet desert of Peru, civilization had bloomed independently. Monumental architecture, sophisticated urban planning, deep spiritual life. All of it created long before the Inca or Maya ever rose to power. And this wasn't just stone and architecture. Ruth Shady and her team found signs of life, rich, layered life. Flutes carved from bird bones, fishing nets woven from cotton, textiles dyed in brilliant natural colors, offerings placed reverently to gods whose names we no longer know. Even quipu, knotted cords used for keeping records. These were not relics of a primitive people. These were the fingerprints of a society grounded in harmony, artistry, and profound intelligence. The rediscovery of Carol wasn't just an archaeological success. It was a resurrection. A city that had slept beneath the desert for millennia now stood revealed, once more under the open sky. Its plazas kissed again by the wind. Its pyramids standing once more like stone hymns to the past. And through it all, you can almost hear them. The echoes of flutes, the rhythm of drums, the laughter of children. A civilization lost in time, now speaking again. Today, Carol is honored as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. More than a destination, it is a fragile yet powerful thread connecting us to humanity's earliest dreams of community, creation, and meaning. For millennia, the sands had kept Carol hidden. But the stones, ancient and patient, endured, waiting for the day someone would look closer, would listen, would remember. Now Carol stands once more beneath the Peruvian sky, silent but towering, a sentinel from the dawn of civilization. Its plazas and pyramids do not boast of conquest or war. Instead, they whisper of a different path. A story not etched in blood, but in balance, beauty, and the brilliant spark of human collaboration. Before the empires of Rome and Greece, even before Egypt raised its first obelisks, the people of Carol were already building something extraordinary. They carved pyramids without metal, mapped the heavens without written language, and fostered trade networks without armies. Their civilization flourished not on the backs of the conquered, but through connection, ritual, and ingenuity. In a world often defined by conflict, Carroll offered a glimpse of what society can become when it values harmony over dominion. Carroll teaches that complexity need not be born of violence. That greatness is not in how many fall, but in how many rise together. Here was a civilization that measured its success in shared effort, sacred music, celestial knowledge, and the quiet dignity of enduring architecture. Its legacy stretches far beyond the Soup Valley. Carroll challenges the myth of a singular birthplace for civilization. It shows that humanity's capacity for wonder bloomed in many lands, under many skies, led by hands as diverse as the people who shaped them. The same desire pulsed through them all, to build, to belong, to touch the divine. Even today, walking among the worn stones of Carroll, you can almost hear it. The distant echo of flutes, the rhythm of drums echoing in sacred plazas, the soft chatter of merchants, and the laughter of children dancing through ancient corridors. These echoes remain, timeless, gentle, persistent. Carroll reminds us, civilizations may crumble, but their spirit endures. Beneath the sands of time, their wisdom sleeps, waiting for rediscovery, waiting to inspire. In the vast scroll of human history, Carroll is not just a forgotten chapter, it is a guiding star. Proof that in even the most unlikely places, beneath sun-scorched skies and shifting dunes, humankind has always dared to imagine more. And in that imagining, we still find the roots of our future.